The only other thing I want to show you before we finally dive into building a CSS-based page layout is spacing your objects apart. In other words, creating gaps of space between my colored boxes in my example here. So in other words, all of the edges of my containers are all touching at this point, and maybe I want to space things apart a little bit. So how am I going to pull that off? Well, if we were using absolute positioning or some of the other positioning values that we saw earlier, I could make use of, do you remember we were using top, bottom, left, and right, and we could push objects around on our page? Well, we can't do that if we're using floats. So instead, what we have to do is we have to make use of margin. Remember our margin property. Now, I'm sure you remember this. Margin is the spacing on the outside of the element. So what I could literally do is put some space, for instance, around my blue div and essentially push it away from other elements on screen. Let me give you a quick example. Maybe I'll give you a few examples here. The first example is a simple one. I just want to create a gap of space, a column of space between my green div and my red div. So how am I going to pull that off? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set a margin left value on my green div. In other words, on the left edge of my green box. Let's go and check that out. It's a pretty simple concept here. So I'm going to go and find my green div inside my code. And then all I'm going to do is I'm going to throw on margin-left. And then I'll throw in some kind of a value. I'm not really sure how much space I want. I just know that I want some space. So maybe I'll start things off by throwing in 10 pixels followed by a semicolon, save that up and refresh my browser. And now the green div is pushed away from the right edge of the red div by the value that I specified, 10 pixels. I could do the same for the top as well if I wanted to. I can come back here and I could say margin-top, full colon space, and then once again throw in some kind of a value. I'm going to try 20 pixels. Save and refresh. There we go, something like that. So very similar to what we saw once again using the positioning and the top, bottom, left, and right. I'm literally pushing this object around on screen, but of course this time I'm using margin values. So if you want, you can experiment for a few minutes. You could try out changing some of the different margin values that we have for some of the different objects that we have. For instance, our yellow div. Maybe I want to go and more precisely position this guy. Well, first of all, go and find him in the code and then go and throw on some kind of a margin value. Now, what I could do here is rather than specifying a side like margin top or margin bottom or something like that, again, I can get into using my shorthand. I could say margin, and then I could say, all right, top and bottom, I want 20 pixels. Left and right, I want 50 pixels. Something like this, right? Save and then refresh. And now I've created that space, that gap of space around the outside of this particular element, okay? This is definitely going to serve us when we go to build our floating CSS layout. And as a matter of fact, I'm ready to roll. I want to show you now how to build a CSS-based floating layout.